when it comes to interviews, if I have one tip for all of you is, I go into the interview thinking to myself, it's really just a conversation. Definitely should not feel like you've been taken to the police station where you're being interrogated.
I running career school on YouTube. I get so many questions about interviewing with big tech companies, and I am usually pretty good with answering all these, non-tech like interviews. But I always struggle to provide tips for people who are looking for interview tips for software engineering, software architects, product management, program management and stuff. And one of the main questions I get from these people is around system design interview. I Googled it. Honestly, I have no idea what it is. So today I brought in an expert who can actually go through what system engineering interviews look like and how to crack those. So I have Lewis Lin, who is a 8-time best-selling author and a CEO for 2 companies. Welcome, Luis, to the channel. I am such a big fan of yours. I don't know if you remember, but like we actually met at UNC when I was an MBA student there. I am a big fan of your book, Decode and Conquer. It's a real honor to have you in the channel.
Thank you so much for having me. It's absolutely been great, and yeah, it's fantastic to hear that we first connected at that interview workshop for the UNC MBAs, and now it's like, gosh, full circle. We're doing this chat, and now we're residing in the same city. So, gosh, good reminder that the world is small.
It's the world is small, and like time flies so fast. I just wanted to, before we kind of kick it off, I wanted to ask you, like, I mean, obviously, a lot of people know you, but I wanted to ask you, like, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. These days, I'm an entrepreneur. And so I get myself involved in a lot of different things. As you mentioned earlier, I am running 2 companies. I figure if Elon Musk and formerly Jack Dorsey, but apparently he's now only focused on one. But if they could do it, I could do it too. But clearly my companies are at a different scale. So the first company is Impact Interview. It's a company that I started back in 2008. We offer interview coaching for job seekers, and we do one-on-one coaching of a team of coaches that help job seekers. Like we mentioned, I do interview workshops for business schools across North America. And then, of course, some of the books that you see in my virtual background, that is part of that business as well. The second business is called Via Maven, and it's a software startup. It's a performance feedback generator. So for all of you who have had the pain of creating your own performance reviews, whether it's for your direct reports or for your peers, we have a solution for that, where we have a huge database of 4,000 phrases where you can just point and click, and then you click build a review button, and voila, it's something that you can copy and paste into Workday. And so that's what I'm up to these days. I'm super fortunate to have this setup. And then just real quickly, before I became an entrepreneur, I got my CS degree from Stanford. I got my MBA from the Kellogg School of Management, and I spent 10 to 15 years in corporate America, places like Google and Microsoft.
Awesome. So let's get into the actual system design interviewing questions. I kind of was wondering, like, so what is a system design interview?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. So the system design interview, those questions really revolve around building a system, a software system. And so you might get a question like design Twitter, or build YouTube, or design a URL shortener like Bitly. And the reason that these questions are so popular is that a lot of these hiring managers, interviewers, care about your ability, whether it's as a software engineer or as a TPM, your ability to build scalable systems. And it wasn't something that we worried about back in the 80s or 90s, because we were building software primarily for desktop machines that would serve all of one user. These days, if you're going to build a YouTube, you need to be prepared to handle billions of daily active users, maybe 50 million concurrent users at the same time. And that's a very, very different challenge than building a piece of desktop software back in the 1990s,
Yeah.
where it's really designed for just one person and not 1.8 billion people, for example.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So what really matters in terms of like the interview system design interview? What are the hiring managers, interviewers, employers like looking for when they are asking these questions to the people?
Yeah. So there's a couple things that come in mind. Number one, can you build a system that scales? And so,
Mm,
building a system that can uh, show videos or pictures on an Instagram like app for one person,
yeah.
not a difficult thing. But being able to scale, that's the absolute challenge. So scalability is the first thing. The second thing is they're looking for your technical judgment. Can
Mm,
you realize that there are multiple technical approaches, solutions to a given problem, and do you understand the trade-offs between each one? And then there's some other things that they're looking for as well. They're also looking for your ability to collaborate and communicate your thoughts and to influence others as to why proposal A is better than proposal B. And then
mhm.
finally, understanding of requirements. It's just way too often that candidates get a question like design YouTube and they say, oh, yeah, yeah, I get what you mean. And then they run off and do it, but they don't even clarify some basic constraints like, hey, if the internet access is spotty, should the site be operational, yes or no? And so they could potentially miss that, and they might get dinged by the interviewer for not clarifying that constraint.
Yeah, those are really good points. And when you say something about clarifying the question, I think it was also mentioned in the Decode and Conquer book as well, because I like it was my Bible when I was interviewing.
Thank you.
But yeah, like I really love because I'm on the interviewer side right now, and for even non-tech interviews, and like people who clarify questions, I love those because it kind of tells me that they are actually thinking about it and then thinking about like what I'm thinking about. So I think those are really good points that you mentioned. Um, Kind of piggyback on the questions you had, like for example,
Mhm.
design on YouTube, design on Twitter. I think a
Mhm.
lot of them, for me, I feel like I got a few of them when I was interviewing for a product manager back in the day. So I like one of my questions were, how does a system design interview differ? Like how is it different from like a product manager interview, for example? Because
Mm.
product manager interviews actually do ask you questions like build a YouTube for like sports
Mm.
fans. I think that's an actual question I got when I was interviewing with Google.
Mm.
So I kind of wonder like what would be the main difference between those two?
Yeah, no, I understand the confusion. And a lot of these questions kind of sound similar, but there's a nuance. And the nuance is this. To me, one of those questions is about what are we trying to build? And
Mm,
then the other category of questions is about how do we build it?
mm-hmm,
So the system design questions, it's really about the how do we build it. So when they ask
mm,
design Twitter, design YouTube,
mm,
it's less about what kind of innovations, what kind of new features you're trying to build into YouTube. It's just about
mm,
to build YouTube as is, present day.
mm-hmm,
What are the steps that you're going to take? What are some of the technical decisions that you're going to make? And so it's really about the how. In the what category, they could ask you, how would you uh, design YouTube 2.0. And so to me, I'm thinking about, okay, that's about a future version of YouTube. And so a
mm,
future version of YouTube, it doesn't exist today. And so they're probably thinking, what would you include? What kind of features? How would it be different from the current one?
gotcha.
And so, um, yeah, I would say
Yeah.
at the end of the day, maybe one of the most important things a candidate could do is to clarify with the interviewer. When you say,
Mm-hmm,
Yong, if you want me to design YouTube, are you talking about how I would design YouTube,
mm,
or are you talking about what kind of new innovations
mm,
would I'd like to see in YouTube? And I would say that's probably one of the most important clarifying questions
yeah.
that a candidate should answer because especially for product management, where they will get either uh, product design questions. It's clearly the most popular type of case interview question, but A lot of PM roles will also get system design questions. The Google PM interview is actually probably the most notorious for asking system design along with product design questions.
So who should be expecting these questions? Like in terms of like roles, I would understand that it's like,
Yeah.
software engineers maybe, but like, can you share a little bit about like who would be expecting these questions?
Yeah, it'll touch on a variety of job functions. First and foremost, software engineers,
Mm,
especially ones that maybe are 2+ years out of college. Once again, it's just the way of the role these days. Everyone's working on some big scalable internet system that is either mission critical or supporting millions and potentially billions of concurrent users. And so to understand the technical trade-offs of building scalable systems is absolutely key.
mhm.
So software engineers, absolutely. Software architects, that's traditionally been their role, is to help think through some of
Yeah.
the top level architecture. But you are seeing more and more companies wanting to have other people outside of the software architects,
Mm,
including the software engineers, the engineering managers, the TPMs, the product
mhm.
managers, to weigh in on these questions. And then, by implication, PMs and the TPMs as well. And so I think at this point, most people are like, oh, it's like PMs and TPMs, like, I don't code. The last time I encountered these concepts was 15 years ago, 20 years ago in an introductory CS class. Like, it
Mm.
doesn't seem very appropriate for me, being a non-expert, to impose my opinion on how a system should be built.
Yeah.
And that's where like imposter syndrome is just ringing off the hook. Um, but these days, here's why it's important, and this is why hiring managers um, are looking for folks,
Mhm.
beyond just the architects, beyond just the software engineers, to chime in on how a system should be built technically. And at the end of the day, it's this.
Yeah, for
They
sure.
need somebody to take a leadership role and to step in and say, okay, I hear you. Yes, there's like 27 different ways to implement this.
Mhm.
There's a lot of pros and cons, but we should go forward and do,
Yeah.
approach number 26 and hear the reasons why.
Yeah.
And thank you everyone for your opinions forward. And so sometimes, the person playing that leadership role could be a engineering manager. Sometimes
Mm,
it could be the architect. Sometimes it could be a senior software engineer. And in some organizations, it might be the PM or the TPM launching that
gotcha.
tiebreaker vote, or that kind of like summary, like, hey guys, like, we can't just debate for the next 5 years. We actually have a deadline to adhere to. And so that's why these hiring managers
Yeah.
are folks who, are familiar with the technical details, familiar with the pros and cons. They don't necessarily have to suggest the solutions themselves, but they need to be enough of a leader to facilitate these technical discussions. And I know, once again, a lot of imposter syndrome probably ringing for your listeners here. But it's just the way of the world.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense, and I mean, it happens all the time. It's a real world challenge, so it definitely makes a lot of sense. So in terms of cracking the interview, I know that you had these awesome circles method when it comes to the product manager interview, and I was really impressed about this petals framework that you have built for the system design interview as well. Can you share a little bit about the framework, and then how you people can actually use it when they're interviewing?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up circles and now petals. Maybe I just have a thing for circular objects. That's why I keep going with these acronyms. But yeah, the whole purpose of a framework, to me, I try not to overthink it. It's basically a checklist
Mhm.
of what I need to cover to make sure that the conversation with the interviewer is complete and satisfying. And it's the same reason that experienced airplane pilots, neurosurgeons use checklists themselves. It's not because they have no training. Of course, they're highly trained,
Yep.
but they're in a high consequence situation. If they make a mistake, they're going to be screwed, and they don't want to
Yep.
make mistakes. And the same exact thinking, I'm thinking about when I'm interviewing at a place like Amazon, Google, Facebook. Like I want these jobs. I don't want to screw up because
Exactly.
who knows, I might not have another chance. Um, and so the petals method, I'll quickly go through each one of the steps.
Yeah.
It's a nice like linear sequential checklist in terms of like how you should
Hmm.
approach the system design interview.
Hmm.
And so the very first step, the P in petals stands for processing the requirements, which is really just a fancy way of saying clarifying the situation.
Hmm.
And this is your opportunity to ask like, hey, how many users are we trying to support concurrently when we're building a system like YouTube?
Mm.
Should we have any sort of failover? Should we be operational when there's no access to the internet? Just to add a little bit more emphasis on the importance of requirements. I remember there's been a legendary Microsoft system design question. It doesn't sound like a system design question, but it is because it's about the how.
Yeah.
And they basically say, like, hey, Lewis, like how would you go about building an airport? And
Ah.
here's an example of where me and 98% of the candidates out there make a fatal mistake for not clarifying the situation. Because when we hear airport, we're like, I got this thing in the bag.
Yeah.
You're going to have multiple terminals, and they're going to have gates, and then you're going to have several runways, and then you're going to have food courts
Yeah.
and VIP lounges. And then 40 minutes later, the Microsoft
Yeah.
interviewer says, Lewis, you missed something. I'm like, what did I miss? This sounds like a typical airport. Like, I'm not an
Yeah.
idiot. And like, Lewis, you forgot to ask me how much land we have, and we only have half
Oh.
an acre. And I'm like, oh,
Oh.
okay. So never mind the runways, let alone the food court, right? We need other solution. We need to design like a
Yeah.
helipad or something
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that. Right. And so that's the traditional gotcha question where it's like, you
Yeah.
didn't clarify
Clarify.
those constraints. And so that's step number one, is to
Hmm.
process the requirements. Step number two is the estimation phase. And this is something that's optional. You don't see this in all system design questions, but if you're interviewing for a role where they believe your analytical skills is something that they want to
Hmm.
evaluate, they might throw in a Fermi question, which we call an estimation question. So your typical Fermi question
Yep.
is, how many gas stations are there in the
Yeah.
United States? In the context of system design question, they'll usually choose something a little bit more appropriate to the product that
Hmm.
you're building. So they might say, hey, how much storage do we need in the next 12 months to store all the videos that would be uploaded into YouTube? And so, it's a little bit of a detour. It'll probably take you like 10 to 15 minutes to do that back of the envelope calculation. But there are some interviewers who want to see that you are comfortable crunching those numbers, that you
Numbers.
have good judgment.
Yep.
And it's
Yeah.
also part of just, clarifying the requirements as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
They might ask you to estimate the storage needed. They might ask you to estimate the number of servers needed. And
Mm.
so those could all be variations that are very specific to the system design question.
Hmm.
Um, the next step of Petals is designing the service. And for those of you who remember from your introductory CS classes, this is basically just modular decomposition. Can you take this
Mm.
big monolithic application like YouTube and figure out like what are the key components
Mm.
to that? And so one key component for YouTube could be the ability to upload and download videos, or another key component is the ability to create, modify, or delete users, or
Hmm.
maybe another component is a commenting system, creating comments, editing
Yep.
comments, moderating comments. These days, because all the applications are internet first, they usually like it when you're defining these modular services in the terms of API endpoints.
Mm.
And
Okay.
so, even the non-technical folks in the audience,
Yeah.
you've probably seen an API endpoint before, which is you go to a browser, you type in youtube.com, and you see /videos, and then after videos is some identifier. It's basically a call to the YouTube systems to say, hey, when that endpoint gets submitted to our servers, just start playing this video
Mm.
that's in that
Yeah.
video ID, if you will. And so if you can do that, you'll absolutely get massive bonus points for it.
Yeah.
As part of designing the service, you might get into some questions about like, hey, you're going to design, let's say, a news feed for YouTube. What are the different ways that you can implement it? And so
Hmm.
there might be a way that you could, I'm going to use a little bit of jargon. You can have a push method or a pull method. And this is your opportunity to talk about the pros and cons of each, the trade-offs. And so you should absolutely be comfortable getting these follow-up questions like, why did you choose the push method? Why did you choose the pull method? What are the
Hmm.
flaws of the pull method? And I think some folks, they might be taken aback by the interactive nature of it, especially if
Hmm.
they've got kind of like their math hats on, where they're like, "Hey, I just need to give the answer, 2 + 2 = 4. Don't ask me any more questions." And so, that interactive nature is absolutely
Yep.
reflective of what happens in the real world, right?
Oh
Like
yeah.
when you go to a meeting and you present something, people will ask you follow-up questions like, why'd you propose this? Why did you propose that? Why
Exactly.
did you think about this or that? And you can't say, I didn't know you're going to ask me follow-up questions. Let me come
Exactly.
back to you. It just
Yeah.
seems too awkward, right? And so
Yep.
that mimics some of that natural collaboration, that communication, that influence that they're expecting at the interview itself. Great. So we covered the D. There's just only a few more letters left. The next one, the A, is to articulate the data model. And this is really the opportunity to specify what kind of information is being stored for a system like YouTube. So
Mm-hmm.
this is where they want you to get into the nitty gritty about the database tables. Like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
we need a database table that stores all the video information, or we need a
Mm-hmm.
database table that stores all the user information. And they want you to specify the fields in that database. And so,
Mm-hmm.
hey, for the user table, we need the first name, the last name, the username, the create
Mm-hmm.
date, the join date, the last time they logged in, the number, an array of all the
Mm-hmm.
different followers or subscribers, to use the YouTube vernacular,
Mm-hmm.
that are part of the system.
Yeah.
Um, it's to me, it's a little bit of a corny question because it's almost like a memorization exercise. Um, but I guess it's just part and parcel of, you know,
Yeah.
if you're a good participant in these technical discussions, in the real world, one of your coworkers might,
Ask
we
you
call them
questions. Mm-hmm.
UML diagrams. They might submit a UML diagram
Mm-hmm.
of all the information that they want to store
Mm-hmm.
for this system.
Mm-hmm.
And like, how you, the interview candidate, can you give good feedback
Mm-hmm.
on their UML output? And if you
Mm-hmm.
can't, that's a problem. And
Yeah.
so a little bit corny, memorization test, like Lewis, like, what did I just Google? What kind of information
Yeah.
I would
Yeah. Yeah.
store? Um, but it's, I
Yep.
understand why it's being asked. It's
Yep.
reflective of the
Yep. For
real.
sure.
The last two pieces, the L and the S,
Mm-hmm.
which it stands for list the um, architecture, and then the scale.
Mm-hmm.
This is where they want you to get up to the whiteboard, or
Oh,
these
okay.
during the pandemic and the Zoom interviews, the virtual whiteboard. And these days, most candidates like to use a whiteboard tool called Excalidraw.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they actually want you to draw out the architecture, like, we need a server here, we need a
Oh
database
wow.
there, and to take that basic architecture and just even scale it out. And so, fronting all the servers, we want a load balancer.
Yeah.
To improve performance, we need to have some content delivery networks. In terms of the database, to minimize the load on certain databases, we need a bunch of free replicas. And so it will get absolutely into that nitty gritty in terms of the cloud components.
So in terms of the actual like the interview, like the system design interview, would candidates be asked questions? Like would candidates be asked to, like, for example, code for like in real time, or would they be more so around less of coding, but more so around, like, are you able to, share what you're thinking throughout this
Yeah,
whole interview?
it's pretty rare to get a coding question during the system design interview.
Okay,
Um, Partly because it's already so involved as it is.
gotcha.
Partly
Yeah.
because if they did want to ask you a coding interview question, they probably would have asked it elsewhere, especially for the
Mm,
software engineers.
makes sense.
I could see them doing like a um, little snippet of like, hey, for this particular service that you mentioned, Can you quickly write the code, the algorithm for following,
Mm-hmm.
suggesting followers for
Mm-hmm.
your Twitter account, for example.
No, that makes sense. Where would I be able to find some sample questions and answers?
Yeah. So the you can see my virtual background over here on the on my lower left. Exactly. Thank you, Yang.
Of course.
The system design interview. It's my newest book. We just published it roughly about 6 months ago. And it's got plenty of system design examples. It's got examples around designing YouTube, designing Twitter, designing URL shorteners, and it's not just sample questions and answers. It goes into the petals framework in much, much more detail. And then even before that, I did want to make it fairly accessible to all audiences, including non-technical ones. And so it's got a really, at least in my opinion, I work really hard to make a technical glossary to introduce key technical concepts, as well as design patterns, so that even folks who are just not well versed in system design can get a nice introduction without feeling overwhelmed by
Well,
jargon.
yeah, that was it, Lewis. Thank you so much for your time today. Really, really
Yeah,
appreciate
thanks for
any.
having me. It's been great. I had a lot of
Yeah,
fun. As you can tell, I'm
yeah,
super passionate about this content.
yes. Any final comments?
Yeah, no, I would just say, best of luck with the system design interviews in general. And when it comes to interviews, if I have one tip for all of you is, I go into the interview thinking to myself, it's really just a conversation. It's like
Mm,
grabbing a cup of coffee with a coworker and, just one colleague, one expert to another. You're sharing your thoughts about the situation. They're providing your input, you collaborating, incorporating, compromising. And that's what it should feel like. It should just feel like hopefully it's a good thing, another day on the job. It definitely should not feel like you've been uh, taken to the police station where you're being interrogated and you're sweating bullets. If that's what's happening to you, at least that's just not a mental image that helps me out. I would get super stressed out. So I hope you guys have fun with your interviews. These are fun topics to discuss.
awesome. Thank you so much, Luis, and thank you so much, everyone, for watching.